All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Whistler, Executive Director, and I must say it's just terrific to see you all. So thank you for being here and thank you for coming. Before we begin, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, mosquitoes. We haven't been able to figure that one out, but we do have bug spray. And so if any of you feel the need for a bug packet or some spray, just raise your hand and someone will bring it right to you. We've got lots of takers. Good. And following the lecture, there will be a book signing up in that corner. And lastly, before we begin, please turn off your cell phones. I'd also like to share one of this week's upcoming programs. This week, we will be having a 3-day spoken word festival in partnership with the wonderful organization Word by Word. It runs tomorrow through Thursday. Each evening is a doubleheader that begins at 6 with a walking tour featuring poets presenting short poems in response to the sculpture that is scattered across our grounds. And it will be immediately followed by a curated poetry and storytelling performance. And for tomorrow's performance, the artists have been challenged to step outside their typically solitary discipline to create and perform collaborative pieces. And Wednesday's 7 p.m. event will feature the voices of 9 women spanning 7 generations. And Thursday at 7, storytellers will participate in a judged story slam, offering 5-minute true first-person stories reflecting on the theme unsaid. So Word by Word does tremendous work, and it will be different than any other event that you've probably attended here, and very memorable, and I hope you'll consider coming. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's author. Heather Clark earned her bachelor's degree in English literature from Harvard and her doctorate in English from Oxford. Her awards include finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Fellowship, and the LA Times Book Prize in Biography. Heather's work has appeared in numerous publications, including the Harvard Review and the Times Literary Supplement. And she recently served as the scholarly consultant for the BBC documentary Sylvia Plath, Life Inside the Bell Jar. Author Valerie Duff and Boston Globe reviewer described Red Comet as, quote, a critical examination of what it means to be a female artist, to suffer from depression, and to be alone. And the New Yorker praised Clark's work for, quote, not letting Plath's suicide define her artistic achievement, but rather Clark argues with refreshing vigor for her significance to modern letters. The review goes on to state that the result is, quote, a new understanding and appreciation of an innovative, uncompromising poetic voice. So please join me in welcoming Heather Clark. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Because this is my first in-person book event since Red Comet was published in October. So it's very exciting to be looking at faces instead of my own reflection on a Zoom screen. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm so excited to be here where Edith Wharton once lived. There's a sort of nice symmetry, I think, talking about woman writer here at the Mount. So thank you for the invitation. Sylvia Plath is perhaps the best-known American woman poet of the 20th century. Her poems in fiction, especially her 1963 novel, The Bell Jar, are widely taught in high schools and universities across the English-speaking world, while her journals and letters constitute one of the most important Künstlerromans of a woman writer in any era. Her name is regularly invoked in popular culture, often as a shorthand for feminism, confessionalism, or depression, and sometimes all three. Tragically, Plath is also well known for her death. She died by suicide when she was 30, shortly after the publication of The Bell Jar, and just a few months after she and her husband, the British poet Ted Hughes, had separated. Plath had suffered from depression since her teenage years and had attempted suicide once before in 1953. She left behind 2 small children and a body of work whose legal ownership passed to Hughes, who published much of Plath's most important poetry and fiction after she died. During her lifetime, Plath was well known in elite British and American literary circles as a talented writer of poetry and prose, but she never saw the mass success she had always hoped for. The first and only poetry collection published in her lifetime, The Colossus, had a print run of just 500 copies. Though it received excellent reviews, it did not win any literary prizes. Plath's novel, The Bell Jar, also received good reviews in the major British papers, but none of them were strong enough to propel the book onto the bestseller list during her lifetime. And it's so tragic for me to think that she never knew how phenomenally successful The Bell Jar was. Plath had hoped that the novel would earn her enough money to finance her newly independent life as a single mother and writer. But in January of 1963, nothing indicated that the novel would go on to sell over 3 million copies, or that her posthumously published collection, Ariel, would become one of the most influential of the 20th century, or that Plath herself would become an icon. Plath's contemporary iconic status as a feminist, confessional, mad, and I use that in quotes, mad poet, probably would have surprised her. These categories do not capture what the Plath scholar Tracy Brain has called the other Sylvia Plath. Today I'll try to make the case that a new biography of Plath, which would question and revise Plath's place within these familiar categories, was necessary. Plath's work transcends any monolithic category, as does Plath herself. Though her poetry and prose hew closely to her own life, she's a master of irony and performance who plays deftly with concepts of biographical truth. Often, her work reflects political rather than personal concerns. She's a cerebral, formalist, surrealist writer whose work nods backwards to modernism and forwards to postmodernism. Yet that work is often taught as straightforward autobiography or confession in ways that I think gloss over or ignore its ambiguities. For Plath, craft is as important as truth. Many times as I was writing this biography, I wondered if I was on a grand fool's errand. I had read Janet Malcolm's now classic book, The Silent Woman, which cast a cold eye on Plath's biographers. And so I was aware that many who had attempted to write Plath's biography either abandoned the project or had minor breakdowns themselves. This situation was partly a result of practical difficulties working with the Plath estate, which was effectively controlled by Ted Hughes' sister Olwen for many years. And I think it's safe to say that both Ted and Olwen had little regard for aspiring Plath biographers throughout the second half of the 20th century. Even those who obtained permission to cross the moat, like the late Anne Stevenson, found that they were not necessarily given the keys to the castle. Stevenson had the blessing of the Plath estate, but she lost authorial control of her 1989 biography, Bitter Fame, to Olwen Hughes, who insisted on portraying Plath in a harsh light. And actually, all of their correspondence is at Smith College. So it doesn't make for very pleasant reading. So Stevenson lost control of that biography to Olwen. And other aspiring Plath biographers like Harriet Rosenstein, Lois Ames, and Elizabeth Hinchcliffe, they abandoned their projects altogether, even after making substantial headway. I was aware of these failed attempts and the emotional toll they had taken. And then there was my own skepticism, honed over 20 years as an academic working in the field of English literature, a discipline that eschewed biographical interpretations of a literary work. I was trained, like Plath herself, to look for the meaning of a text in its images, rhythms, and themes, certainly not in the details of an author's life. If I dared to write this iconic life, how would my own biases affect the telling? Wouldn't my interpretation be subject to a sort of Heisenberg principle of biography, in which the act of taking the measurement of the life affects the measurement itself? Wouldn't Plath's readers be better off perusing her surviving letters and journals, rather than reading a literary critic's interpretation and distillation of her life? And how would I distill thousands of pages of archival material into one book? How could I convey Plath's experience of depression and suicide to readers with the necessary intimacy and compassion? And how much space would Ted Hughes take up in Plath's narrative? A lot, as it turned out. I wondered if Janet Malcolm had been right all along, that biography, particularly Plath biography, was simply too full of methodological minefields. And yet, I continued to be angered by how the drama of Plath's death had distracted us from the power of her art. It seemed to me that male writers who died by suicide, such as Ernest Hemingway or even David Foster Wallace, were not as negatively defined by their death as Sylvia Plath. Hermione Lee, Virginia Woolf's biographer and Edith Wharton's biographer, has made the point that women writers who suffer from mental illness and suicide are often regarded as, and I quote Lee here, case histories first and professional writers second, unquote. And I think these words are especially true for Sylvia Plath, who's often been pathologized in biographies, television, movies, and magazines. Plath's suicide provides her critics with an excuse not to take her art seriously, that is, to equate her fame with her death. And I can't tell you how many times people have come up to me and said, well, she's only famous because she committed suicide. As the critic Janet Badia points out, I think this also gives people a reason to talk about her and her readers as a cult. That word cult gets thrown around a lot. And early reviews set the tone for such reductive characterizations of Plath and her work. After Plath's poetry collection Ariel was published in 1965, Time magazine called it, quote, a jet of flame from a literary dragon who in the last months of her life breathed a burning river of bale across the literary landscape. The Washington Post called Plath a snake lady of misery in an article entitled The Cult of Plath. Robert Lowell wrote an introduction to Ariel in which he connected Plath's suicidal tendencies to her poems, while the poetry critic Al Alvarez called her a, quote, priestess emptied out by the rites of her cult, unquote. And Ted Hughes, too, sometimes wrote melodramatically about Plath's dangerous muse. I wasn't surprised by these oracular, supernatural descriptions. We've long regarded male poets as secular prophets touched by fire. Think of Coleridge, Keats, even Yeats. But women poets who try to claim this lofty mantle, especially in the era before second wave feminism, often found that their attempts were likened to witchcraft or quasi-occult practices by the male critical establishment, hence the priestess label. Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, I think, understood the reductive power of this stereotype and both played with the idea of black magic in their poetry. Sexton even famously compared her speaker to a witch in her best-known poem, Her Kind. Plath had been intrigued by the figure of the Egyptian goddess Isis, and both she and Ted Hughes were fascinated by Robert Graves's book, The White Goddess. But the posthumous identification of Plath herself with priestly rites, possession, and witchcraft is at worst sexist and at best patronizing. Plath wrote to a friend in 1954, quote, I am a damn good high priestess of the intellect, unquote. Well before Ariel, Plath was already playing with this idea of the woman poet and redefining it. Her ironic command of this trope was very clear to me in poems like Lady Lazarus and Daddy, whose speakers believed that they possessed the power to kill men. But not everyone saw the irony. The romantic characterization of Plath as a priestess emptied out by the rites of her cult, combined with her story of depression and suicide, stalled, I think, biographical attempts to consider her, in Hermione Lee's words, a professional writer first. And I have to say it was Hermione Lee herself and her words that finally galvanized me and provided the necessary inspiration to believe that writing a new biography of Sylvia Plath, one that would read her life forward as an aspiring writer rather than backward as a life set on a course for suicide, that this was really a necessary and worthwhile project. I I decided I would try to write a book that explored and hopefully exploded some of the cliches attached to Plath and her work. I wanted to show how Plath's writing and life existed in a complex dialogue that made ethical, political, and intellectual demands upon Plath's readers. And I wanted to attempt to remedy the damage done to Plath's artistic legacy by early critical and biographical portraits that sensationalized her death at the expense of her art. This would be, ideally and paradoxically, a book that helped Plath escape her biography. I wasn't necessarily trying to unsettle Plath's iconic status in my biography because I understood that that place was hard-won and cherished by many of her readers. But I also felt that Plath had become a cipher. To some, she was a warrior saint. To others, a fallen angel. I felt her iconic, almost mythic status did not help us get any closer to an understanding of her everyday lived experience as a writer, daughter, student, wife, mother. This was the biographer's more quotidian terrain, closer to archaeology than psychoanalysis. Plath was not, after all, Lady Lazarus, who rises like a phoenix to eat men like air. She was not the daughter who declares ritual murder against her father in Daddy, not the dead woman who is perfected in Edge, one of her final great poems. Maybe Plath would have been pleased by such identifications. In her poem Ariel, the speaker seems to want to become her art, as Yeats desires in his poem Sailing to Byzantium. But I wanted to tell the story of how Plath created her art, not the story of how she became it. We are familiar with Plath, the bereaved daughter, the asylum patient, the wronged, vengeful wife, the suicide. It is a tale colored by darkness and trauma. When we emphasize this trajectory as the defining story of Plath's life, we miss the other story that hides in plain sight, that of a writer finding and fulfilling her vocation. This is the story of Plath's life I wanted to tell because it is the one that she tells so clearly about herself in her journals and her letters. Her near constant theme is not depression in those journals and letters, but the holy quest to become a writer. Plath's ambition and determination her ambition and determination to write eclipses for me almost everything else in her life. And she never veered from this goal. Her literary vocation was her true north. But keeping my focus on Plath's literary trajectory as an artist was not always easy. Sometimes even I found myself falling into what my editor called the Plath trap. That is, reading her work too autobiographically or using language that subtly pathologized her. I made a mental note to avoid using words like obsessed, neurotic, helpless, tragic, fragile, and doomed. I realized that even the word recover, which was actually part of my book's original title, it was Recovering Sylvia Plath, Her Life and Art. That was the first title. We went through many. Even that recover was fraught for the way it lionized the biographer at the expense of her subject. And it made Plath seem too passive and ceded control of her narrative to me. I wanted to center Plath's voice and let her tell her own story in her own words as much as I could. I had planned to write a biography of about 500 pages, but I ended up publishing a book double that length. One of the aspects of Plath's personality that I came to appreciate was her ambition to take up space, both physically and intellectually. She had an enormous appetite that was just legendary for food and men and everything. So she wanted to take up that space in a male-dominated world that encouraged to make themselves small. So I felt it was appropriate that her biography take up space with its 3-inch spine. We're used to biographies of great men taking up space on the bookshelf. We take for granted that they've earned that space. And I see nothing but praise, and rightfully so, for Robert Caro's slow, methodical, 5-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. Each volume ranges between 500 and 1,000 pages, which I think is fantastic. Surely one of the greatest and most influential poets of the 20th century, male or female, deserves a thorough single volume. But the standards seem higher somehow for women. The Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Caroline Fraser has commented upon the biographical double standard in which men are praised for their ambition, while ambitious women tend to be pathologized or even subtly shamed. Her comments rang true to me. Biographers have been particularly guilty of pathologizing Plath and her desire to write. As Anne Stevenson wrote in Bitter Fame, quote, "Her gift was for romantic self-aggrandizing. Sylvia was trapped in her own story, condemned to telling it again and again to whoever would listen. She was indeed cursed." Cursed? What? Here, one of the most talented, innovative poets of the 20th century is reduced to a self-aggrandizer, trapped and condemned by her own story. Stevenson's Plath writes out of desperation rather than fulfillment. A more recent biographer wrote that Plath was, quote, "addicted to achievement in the same way an alcoholic is hooked on booze," unquote, while her competitive drive was pathological. He actually used the word pathological, and stemmed from interior hollowness. Fraser says that writing about ambitious women is especially tricky because their ambition is hidden, or more often, crushed. Indeed, she frames Plath's death itself as a crude shorthand for the limits of female ambition. She says, "Writing about women who have achieved a modicum of influence can often feel like watching someone on a precipice. 1 foot wrong, and it's the block, the pillory, or the head in the oven." I was aware of the potential pitfalls. Helen Lewis recently reviewed the exhibition by the Renaissance painter Artemisia Gentileschi, excuse me for that, murdered that pronunciation, who is the first woman in the National Gallery's nearly 200-year history to have her own show. Lewis asks, when does feminist celebration become patronizing, an implicit silver medal? As rarities and exceptions, women are often defined by their biography. Never mind the talent, how do we feel about her? Is she good for a woman, or good enough to deserve a place in the canon, regardless of her sex? Elizabeth Bishop, for one, was wary of the silver medal, and once told Robert Lowell that she would, quote, "rather be called the 16th poet," unquote, with no reference to my sex than one of 4 women, even if the other 3 are pretty good. Lewis worries that we demand women artists be good in a way that we do not demand of men. And she writes, "Inspirations, role models, trailblazers, people worth rescuing, something that is not asked of the lecherous Picasso." But Plath was a trailblazer, as both a woman and an artist who helped change the direction of modern poetry. Ignoring that fact seemed worse than calling attention to it. Still, I understand Lewis's point about feminist recovery's good intentions and its limitations. Plath cherished what she called her weirdnesses, and I did not want to present her as an airbrushed feminist saint. It's that kind of characterization that presumably led an audience member to ask at my Harvard bookstore Zoom reading last fall, why should men read Sylvia Plath? I believe Plath would have been surprised, but pleased, to find herself a feminist icon. She was no stranger to women's achievement. Her mother had a college degree and worked as a professor at Boston University, while Plath herself was educated at 2 renowned women's colleges, Smith College and Newnham College, Cambridge, where she was nurtured by prominent female professors. She had read and admired the work of female writers like Virginia Woolf, Sarah Teasdale, H.D., Edna St. Vincent Millay, Edith Sitwell, and others. She wrote in her journal that she wanted to write about women's themes and to sing a female song. But the culture was against her. Plath came of age in a sexist era when women were legally discriminated against. Meaningful educational and professional opportunities for women were scant, and they were at the mercy of a financial system that made it difficult to obtain loans and other forms of credit. Plath received mixed messages from her undergraduate alma mater, Smith College, about how ambitious a woman was allowed to be in the age before second-wave feminism. Academic achievement was lauded and encouraged, but the goal of many Smith graduates in the early 1950s, it seemed, was to marry and have children. Adlai Stevenson codified this unspoken dictum when he told Plath's graduating class in 1955 that they should embrace, quote, the humble role of the housewife, unquote, and focus their energies on their husband's goal. With a can opener in one hand and a baby in the other, I'm paraphrasing him, but he actually used that phrase, they were to create a peaceful, disciplined home. Quote, once they wrote poetry, now it's the laundry list. Stevenson was a liberal Democrat, of course, and his belittlement of women's professional ambitions suggests the larger cultural disregard in which these women's hopes and dreams were held. Indeed, a popular Smith College tune made light of this dilemma. Quote, you're sharp as a pen point. Your marks are really 10-point. Your Dean's List, Sophia Smith, but a man wants a kiss, kid. He doesn't want a quiz, kid. Oh, you can't get a man with your brains. Plath managed to scale some of the gendered barriers of her time through talent and determination. She won a Fulbright Fellowship to Cambridge University. She traveled through Europe, published widely, and embarked upon a creative marriage of true minds with a fellow poet, Ted Hughes. She put off having children until she had achieved at least some of her goals, professional goals, that is. After Hughes left her, she wrote poems of fury that accused both her husband and an entire sexist culture of mistreating women. When Lady Lazarus vows to eat men like air, or when Plath ended her famous 1962 poem, Daddy, 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 you bastard, I'm through, her words signaled to a generation of women that she had triumphed over the father and all that patriarchy stood for. In her poem Stings, from which the title of my biography, Red Comet, comes, Plath writes that she has, quote, a self to recover, a queen. There's no denying that Plath's work helped buttress second-wave feminism, one of the great political movements of the 20th century. After Plath's death, and in the wake of Betty Friedan's 1963 The Feminist Mystique, which, by the way, was published a week after Plath died, so she never got to see the fruits of that. Plath's work, which was increasingly published in women's magazines such as Ms., Red Book, McCall's, and Cosmopolitan, that is after her death, Plath's work became a feminist rallying cry. Poems like Daddy, Lady Lazarus, Fever 103 Degrees, Purda, Three Women, The Applicant, I could go on, speak powerfully to issues of gender and power, to say nothing of their stylistic innovations. But whether Plath intended for poems like Daddy and Lady Lazarus to become veritable anthems of the women's movement is almost beside the point. By the time these poems garnered a popular mainstream audience, the personal had become the political. Yet Plath does not fit neatly into the modern definition of a feminist. Ted Hughes always maintained that she was, quote, Laurentian, not women's lib, unquote. That is, a disciple of D.H. Lawrence's philosophy of sexual liberation for both men and women. He felt that she was used as a pawn by feminists for causes that she herself would not have supported. Hughes had a point. Plath often remarked to others that she had no intention of becoming what she sourly called a career woman. She was repulsed by the culture of spinsterhood amongst the female dons at Newnham College, Cambridge, and she vowed over and over again not to follow the same path. She could be very cruel in her letters and poems toward barren women or to those who had made the decision to have an abortion, and she was fiercely competitive with women whose literary achievements mirrored her own. She put her husband's literary work before hers and willingly took on the bulk of housekeeping and child-rearing. But these behaviors were not so unusual for a white, educated, middle-class woman in the 1950s. The feminist poet Adrienne Rich took on a similar role during her marriage to the Harvard economist Alfred Conrad before she experienced a rebirth as a feminist activist and lesbian in the 1960s. Later, Rich would think of her years as a housewife and mother as years spent sleepwalking. The impact of second-wave feminism had brought her back to life, she said. One wonders whether Plath would have reached a similar point had she lived to see the changes wrought by the women's movement. Because for all her outward conservatism, Plath was an iconoclast. She refused to abide by the sexist mores of the 1950s dictating that women must choose between a family or a literary life. She wanted to have it all before the idea of having it all became a feminist catchphrase. She believed in the equality of opportunity for women, a basic feminist principle, and she was enraged by the sexual double standard of her day, which, anyone who's read her journals knows how furious that made her. Her poems are some of the first and finest in the English language to tackle women's experience, especially motherhood, postpartum anxiety, miscarriage, and childbirth. Indeed, Anne Stevenson called Plath, quote, one of the first great poets of childbirth in the language, unquote. And I think that's true, actually. Plath's poems about motherhood still feel radical to me in a culture that regularly sanitizes and sentimentalizes the experience. But Plath's work was not solely limited to women's concerns or a feminist agenda. Her representations of gender and power were groundbreaking and influential, but she's also a master of her craft, a true poet's poet. Plath had poetic ambitions from the time she was young, and she published her first poem in a Boston newspaper when she was just 8. From then on, she was unstoppable, publishing regularly in her school's literary magazines and newspapers. She sent out dozens of stories and poems to national magazines during high school, and she finally published in 17 and the Christian Science Monitor before college, and she got over 50 rejections in the couple of years before she cracked those publications, but she was so determined. She just sent her stuff out again and again. Eventually, she cracked Harper's, The Atlantic, and in 1958, The New Yorker, which she called her Annapurna. During these years, Plath developed the habits of a professional writer. She kept meticulous track of her work, and when a rejection arrived, she simply sent the piece out to the next publication on her list. She was a marvel of efficiency and productivity, and generally stoic about her rejections. Plath had written many poems in a bold, bracing voice as a child and adolescent, but she had tamped down this voice at Smith, where she became a diligent practitioner of the well-made poem then in vogue. She wrote villanelles and sestinas, and she often consulted a rhyming dictionary and a thesaurus as she wrote in her Smith years. Her verses were exquisitely crafted in the style of poet heroes such as Wallace Stevens and W.H. Auden, but her aesthetic direction began to shift at Cambridge University in 1956 when she met Ted Hughes and his friends, a band of rebel poets tired of the prevailing safe verse of the movement, which then dominated British journals. And she was sort of eager to shock British poetry out of submission, as was Ted Hughes. Plath was starting to feel that her own poetry was too timid, too precious. She wrote in her journal in 1956, quote, "Until I make something tight and riding over the limits of sweet sestinas and sonnets, they can ignore me." By they, she meant Ted Hughes and his band of poet friends, I think. She was ready to abandon what she called poems of glib little smugness. Plath would rediscover her earlier other voice at Cambridge, where she began to embrace a more direct, less genteel style, more Yeats than Stevens. Even then, she wanted to break out of what she called, in a February 1959 journal entry, her glass caul, C-A-U-L. In the spring semester of 1959, when Plath and Hughes were living as freelance writers in Boston, Plath audited Robert Lowell's creative writing class at Boston University. It was here that Plath met Anne Sexton. In this class, often cited as the birthplace of confessional poetry, Plath began to really loosen her lines and tackle riskier subjects, which she had considered taboo, such as mental illness and suicide. Lowell had read parts of his groundbreaking 1959 collection, Life Studies, in this class, and Sexton had actually workshopped some of the poems in her 1960 breakout collection, To Bedlam and Partway Back, in that class. So you can imagine what that atmosphere was like. Lowell and Sexton were important influences, to be sure, but Plath's work veered in a different direction. Her early poetic successes, like The Disquieting Muses, The Colossus, The Poem for a Birthday Sequence, and Electra on Azalea Path, are autobiographical, but actually confess little. Later poems, like Daddy and Lady Lazarus, seem, in Yeats's memorable phrase, to walk naked. But even in these poems, Plath's technique is not so much confessional, but modernist. She hints obliquely at personal struggles and vulnerabilities through classical or mythic scaffolds in the manner of her modernist heroes, Eliot, Yeats, and Joyce. Plath uses speakers like Lady Lazarus, or the murderous Clytemnestra figure of Purda, or the Medea figure of Edge, to actually distance herself from her poems. These poems' aesthetic power rests not upon the force of Plath's personal revelations, but I think her arresting and singular use of myth, irony, allegory, and surrealism. These weirdnesses, as she called them, along with her unforgettable rhymes and meters, are part of what makes Plath's poetry so singular and compelling. I understand that Plath's life makes a tempting case study for psychoanalytically minded biographers and literary critics. The Bell Jar was based on Plath's own breakdown, suicide attempt, and recovery at McLean Hospital, where she drew deeply on her own psychodrama in poems like Daddy and the Colossus, upon her own psychodrama in poems like Daddy and the Colossus. Indeed, Plath blurred the borders between her life and her work in innovative ways that complicate her biographer's task, as I well know. Confessionalism is a convenient label, and this movement toward more direct, honest, and personal speech had enormous repercussions for post-war Anglo-American poetry. And Plath herself seemed happy to be grouped with Lowell and Sexton in a 1962 interview where she discussed her admiration for both poets and her embrace of this new taboo aesthetic. But reading Plath's poems and novel as straightforward autobiographical confession, I think trivializes Plath's artistry because it assumes no ironic separation between Plath and her art, or Plath and her speakers. Plath herself was always suspicious of the confessional impulse, and this might surprise people, but when the poet George Abbé read his work at Smith College in 1958, Plath complained in her journal about his reliance on personal revelations for effect. His poems were, she wrote, quote, about his boyhood, sob, as if poetry were some kind of therapeutic public purge or excretion. Ted and I left, disgusted, to go home to our private and exacting demons who demand every conscious and deep-rooted discipline and work and rewriting and knowledge, unquote. She called Abbé a huckster and mocked his suggestion that anyone can write. Later, at a dinner party in London in 1961, she actually discussed confessionalism with the man who coined the term, the critic M.L. Rosenthal. And he remembered, quote, what she was interested in and what she talked about quite a lot was the question of putting yourself right into the poem and the problem of aestheticizing it, of transcending the material, of getting beyond the personal. We agreed about that. It could be done. It had to be done. It wasn't worth it unless you got past the personal. To eavesdrop on a conversation between Sylvia Plath and the man who coined the term confessional poetry 60 years later was, for me, an extraordinary experience. And this interview was part of a new cache of material that appeared in 2020. Rosenthal's memory suggests that Plath was well aware of confessionalism's temptations and dangers. Indeed, the confessional label is particularly dangerous for women who suffered from mental illness, like Plath and Sexton, because it ties their art to pathology and reduces their work to a straightforward or impulsive cry from the heart. Focusing too much on the life, particularly when that life ended in suicide, distracts, quote, readerly and critical attention from the poetry's artfulness, as the critic Elizabeth Gregory points out. So when we read Plath's poems as autobiographical confessions, I think we, again, miss an opportunity to engage with her ironic self-awareness, her literary sophistication, and her bookishness. As Plath wrote to her friend Phil McCurdy in 1954, I love this quote, she said, "My bookcases are overflowing, shelves of novels, poetry, plays, with lots of philosophy, sociology, and psychology. I am a bibliomaniac." And she underlined bibliomaniac. So Plath, one of the most brilliant students of her generation, she graduated summa cum laude from Smith, by the way, even after she took a lot of time off to recover from her suicide attempt at McLean. She was able to draw upon her vast knowledge of Western literature as she composed her own work. Like the modernists before her, Plath's traditional poetic training allowed her to break from a tradition that had for her run dry and as Ezra Pound exhorted his contemporaries to make it new. Let me give you just a brief example of what we miss when we view Plath's art solely through the lens of her biography. And I know that might be a weird thing for a biographer to ask you to do. But Plath's late poem, Edge, which was dated February 5th, 1963, it was probably the last poem she wrote, about a week before her suicide. It famously begins, "The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment. The illusion of a Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. Her bare feet seem to be saying, 'We have come so far. It is over.' The mother's 2 children lie lifeless at her breast. There is no denying the bleakness, horror, and resignation that underscores this tableau of a dead mother and her children, embodied by the indifferent moon who stares down, sinister and regal, from her hood of bone." I understand why Edge is often interpreted as a kind of posthumous suicide note, a poem that pushes the confessional genre to the extreme. And yet this poem is intensely elusive. Plath draws upon Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, the poetry of W.B. Yeats, Sarah Teasdale, Robert Graves, D.H. Lawrence. She weaves allusions to all of these poets in this quite short poem. She also draws upon the surrealist art of Giorgio de Chirico, the Italian painter whose work had inspired her earlier poetic breakthrough, The Disquieting Muses. De Chirico had painted several paintings of women in classical Greek dress, lying down on slabs in abandoned spaces with trains moving eerily in the distance. Plath wrote in her journal about seeing one of these paintings, Ariadne, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 1958, and she had written about Ariadne in her adolescent poetry as well. Now, Plath was revisiting that theme again, speaking through 2 abandoned classical heroines, Medea and Ariadne, giving them a voice and making, I think, a devastating point about women, power, and silence. Elizabeth Hardwick interpreted Edge as extremist performance art. Quote, I'm quoting Hardwick, "When the curtain goes down, it is her own dead body there on the stage, sacrificed to her own plot." I find Hardwick's statement a grievous mischaracterization of Edge, and all the more puzzling given that Hardwick, as the second wife of Robert Lowell, had a front row seat to the ravages of depression. And just as an aside, Maxine Kumin remembered furiously that Hardwick made a similar remark to her about Anne Sexton. She said, "Well, of course, she was so stagey, she had to kill herself. There was nothing else left for her to do." So she said something similar about Sexton. Anne Stevenson chose to end her controversial Plath biography with Hardwick's quote, followed by Edge itself. Plath's first biographer, Edward Boucher, wrote that Edge was Plath's extended suicide note, full of narcissistic self-absorption and ultimate failure. Joyce Carol Oates evinced a similar frustration with Plath in her highly influential 1973 essay, The Death Throes of Romanticism, in which she made little effort to separate Plath from her speakers and accused Plath in certain poems of reveling in victimhood and spite. Oates mentioned nothing about Plath's craft in this essay, her use of rhyme or meter or overall formal technique. She wrote that Plath could not escape her separate, unhappy self, which was, she thought, an inability that led her to dehumanize people in her work. When we read Plath as merely a confessional poet, without further considering her irony and her elusiveness, we not only trivialize her artistry, I think we also trivialize her political awareness and involvement. The idea that Plath was not a politically engaged person was taken for granted, even by feminist critics, for too long. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, none other than these icons of feminist literary criticism, they wrote that Plath, quote, did not have an explicitly political imagination, while Elizabeth Hardwick wrote that Plath had nothing of the social revolutionary in her. Joyce Carol Oates claimed Plath, quote, exhibits only the most remote and rhetorical sympathy with other people, that she only wants to define herself, her sorrows. This became a common lens with which to view Plath in the late 1970s, 80s, and even 90s. Such admonishments are tied, in my opinion, to Plath's status as a confessional poet, because they do not assume a split between the art and the artist. This mischaracterization allowed critics to effectively write Plath off as uninterested in the crises of her day. She is instead a navel-gazer, interested only in herself and her own crises. A lot of recent criticism, though, has shown that Plath did engage with the politics of her day. She was raised in a family that taught pacifism, an ideology she embraced all her life. Her mother was a Republican, but Plath herself was a really committed Democrat who was disgusted by hawkish Cold War rhetoric and McCarthyism especially. Her middle school and high school papers, along with letters to her German pen pal, reveal her disdain for war and the bomb. And when she was just a high school student in 1950, she published an article called Youth's Plea for World Peace in the Christian Science Monitor, which is a pretty big deal, to get published in high school. She co-wrote it with a friend. She and her co-author took a pacifist position, rejecting the logic of the Cold War arms race and arguing for the basic brotherhood of all human beings. They called nationalism a dilemma. These were radical positions to adopt publicly during the McCarthy era. Plath's public embrace of pacifism, I think, was courageous. For in the early 1950s, pacifism was a suspect ideology that could earn one a place on an FBI blacklist. Even as Plath outwardly conformed to the norms of the 1950s, she nursed a private skepticism about the direction in which America was heading. In 1951, as a college student, she wrote her most political poem yet, called I Am an American, which mocked America's materialist consumer culture. Americans, she wrote, were, quote, baptized with Chanel No. 5 in the name of the Bendix, the Buick, and the batting average. She called attention to American hypocrisy and xenophobia. Quote, we all know that certain truths are self-evident, that we believe in liberty and justice for all, like the great green lady with the bronze torch lifted beside the door marked members only. Plath would become an increasingly passionate Democrat who was crushed when Eisenhower defeated Adlai Stevenson to win the 1952 presidential election. At Smith, she wrote letters and diary entries about her disdain for the Red Hunt. She booed Joseph McCarthy when he came to speak on campus. And she embedded these political stances into The Bell Jar, which she wrote in 1961, but which looked back to her breakdown, suicide attempt, and institutionalization in 1953. I think Plath is one of the great literary chroniclers of mental illness, but she's also an astute critic of the mental health practices of her era. She wrote scathingly in The Bell Jar about the practices to which she was subjected in the 1950s, from condescending therapy sessions to her botched electroshock therapy. Indeed, the political themes of The Bell Jar are hiding in plain sight. Plath begins the novel with a sentence about the looming execution by electric shock of the Rosenbergs, who were sentenced to death for allegedly passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. As the feminist critic Elaine Showalter first suggested, Plath's protagonist, Esther Greenwood, will also suffer electric shock in the form of electroshock therapy for her own brand of dissidence. Plath weaves these two stories together and connects Esther's madness to the sickness of her warmongering, sexist, racist society. The book is a criticism of the repressions of the Eisenhower era and their particularly stultifying effect upon women, as much as it is the chronicle of a breakdown. Plath was committed to the anti-bomb movement and attended the CND March in London in 1960. She wrote to others in the early 60s about her anxieties regarding nuclear fallout and her disgust for the American military-industrial complex. Some of her best-known poems, such as Ariel and Lady Lazarus, were written during the tense days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 and reflect this unrest. Her close friend Elizabeth Sigmund, who eventually became an environmental activist, told me about Plath's passionate interest in politics. After their first conversation in Devon, Plath told her how excited she was to have found what she called a committed woman. Sigmund thought that Plath had she lived, would have joined her on her marches and environmental political campaigns. Sigmund's feeling echoes what another close friend from Plath's childhood and adolescence, Perry Norton, told me about her strong commitment to liberalism and pacifism. We will never know what might have been. Still, if we bother to look beyond the confessional label, much of Plath's work cries out against injustice. Plath may not have been running political committees like Adrienne Rich, but that doesn't mean she was apolitical. She was busy raising 2 children, running a household, and acting as Ted Hughes's agent and secretary. She spent nearly all of her precious free time writing. In the face of immense societal pressure to make herself small and to sacrifice her literary ambitions to her children and her husband, writing poetry and fiction was itself a political act. In The Bell Jar, Esther Greenwood manages to write her own story, despite her troubled history. She has made herself the subject in a world that prefers to see women as objects. Her pain and struggle are buoyed by humor and wit. Plath suggests in the end that Esther's ability to control her narrative and her destiny is a triumph. When I think about the novel's ending now, I wonder how Plath would feel about the way I've told her story. Would she think I've hit the mark, or that I've overshot by a mile? The best I can hope for, I think, is to land somewhere in between. As T.S. Eliot writes in 4 Quartets, there is only the trying. Thank you.